I've never been the kind of person who easily resorts to or even sympathizes with conspiracy theories. And of course, there can be considerable social consequences and fallout for those that do, for a variety of reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that the media relentlessly repeats this narrative that conspiracy theories are dangerous. But it seems to me that as a modern culture, we have a massive blind spot where this is concerned, because just about for all of the historical religions, to reject their claims is to indulge in something like a conspiracy theory. And by historical religion, I mean those that ground their claims and their stories in the history that we're all familiar with, which is something that was virtually unheard of before Judaism and then Christianity, which is descended from it, because pagan religions, their stories, they almost always take place in some other reality, some other dimension of reality. But with Judaism and Christianity, God enters into the story of human history in a way that was entirely novel up until that point. And while I tend to not sympathize with most popular conspiracy theories, I do think that some are more likely than others, and that tends to correlate to how complex they are. The more complicated the supposed conspiracy is, I would say that the less likely the theory concerning it is true. So in the case of religious traditions, if rejecting the central claims of a historical religion means you have to then explain the true origin of that religion through something like a conspiracy theory, the question then becomes for me, how hard would it have been for the supposed conspirators to have hatched that particular deception? Thinking about this reminded me of a rebuke against the Bible that I came up with when I was a teenager, which I conceived of to demonstrate two things. First of all, how clever I was, and second of all, how stupid the Bible and anyone who believed in it are. It went something like this. Just because you have a book of stories doesn't mean those stories are actually true. Like, what if 1,000 years from now, someone came across an otherwise long forgotten copy of The Lord of the Rings and concludes that, wow, this must all be true, and then they started religious devotion to the cult of Frodo and Gandalf. Pretty clever, right? Well, unfortunately, it's not that uncommon, a refutation of Christianity in the Bible, as I've come across something almost exactly like it several times in my travels here on YouTube. The analogy here, of course, is that plenty of people could write a story that makes the kinds of claims that The Lord of the Rings does, either for amusement or maybe even for deception, but in either case, only a fool would take those stories as some sort of literal historical truth, and that, according to 13-year-old me, something like that is probably going on with the Bible. The perception among anyone who finds this kind of argument persuasive is that the Bible is a book written by one or perhaps a sample of a small group of people, in the same way that The Lord of the Rings is a book written by one person, and if one person can draft something as sophisticated and impressive as the cosmos and legendarium of Middle-earth, then why couldn't the same be true for the legendary stories of the Bible? The fact that this book exists and the kinds of claims that it makes doesn't require us to look to God as evidence for its existence. And then once you've dispensed with Christianity, you can go ahead and apply this same kind of critical method to other religious traditions that claim to be grounded in history. Take Islam, for example. Islam is the product of one person and his co-conspirators. That person is Muhammad. He had a supposed revelation from God, and then he recorded that revelation with the help of some friends, because he was illiterate, into what we now know as the Quran. A prophetic voice, a holy book written in a short period of time by a small group of people with concepts that were already fairly familiar to most religious traditions at the time, followers, and then the promise of eternal life. These kinds of ingredients don't require a supernatural explanation. This is the kind of thing that could be easily explained as a conspiracy of people who wanted to deceive the masses in order to gain followers and then political and economic wealth. And in the case of Muhammad, that's kind of exactly what happened. He became a powerful military leader and a political figure. He gained wealth, slaves, and a harem of wives that would have been the envy of plenty of men in his day. Now, I'm not saying this is the true explanation of the origin of Islam, just that it isn't that far-fetched as a theory. It's quite feasible, and considering how uncommon such a vivid revelation from God is, What's the more likely explanation? Another example follows a very similar pattern in the story of the LDS Church and of Joseph Smith. He claims to have had a revelation from God. He composes the Book of Mormon in a relatively short amount of time with the help of only a very few select inner circle people, and then discovers a variety of artifacts which supposedly prove his claims, but then mysteriously disappear and are never shown or produced to the discerning public. But again, those claims don't require us to invoke the supernatural. Joseph Smith didn't perform any miracles to the astonishment of non-believers. He didn't say anything particularly original, and the Book of Mormon could have easily been written without the help of God. And Smith and his closest friends did have a lot to gain if the whole thing succeeded, such as, again, political influence, wealth, and women. And while Joseph Smith did meet a violent end, it wasn't until after he was able to enjoy some of these things, the kinds of things that attract the most basic instincts of a lot of people. And then his successors, like Brigham Young, did live a life of luxury, power, and wealth, along with his 56 wives. But I would say that historical religions with those kinds of origin stories are susceptible to conspiracy theories if you were so inclined. But what about Christianity if we really give it a fair hearing? Well, the thing that poor 13-year-old me and many of the commentators that I come across on YouTube don't seem to understand is that the Bible isn't a single book written by one person. Rather, it's a library of books written by dozens of authors separated by significant spans of space and time. It's one thing to accuse the founders of the LDS Church, who all lived at the same time and all knew each other, of conspiring together to fabricate a revelation and a holy book. But to accuse the authors of the Bible of somehow coordinating a conspiracy that spans 1,500 years or more, well, now we're getting into territory of the very unlikely. Because for a conspiracy to work, it has to be something that can be reasonably coordinated between the conspirators and have some reasonable chance of succeeding for them to all go in on it together. So, for example, you might be somebody who is persuaded by the claim that the KGB actually assassinated JFK, because a theory like that isn't impossible to conceive of. The KGB had the potential power to coordinate an effort like that. It isn't unreasonable to imagine why they would do something like that, and there would have been a reasonable chance of success and a desirable outcome for the conspirators involved. Something like that isn't so complicated, but to coordinate the canon of the Bible, to make its message coherent, to develop it author after author, generation after generation, all leading up to the events of Jesus' life, teaching, death, and resurrection, which fulfilled dozens of well-known and documented prophecies within the Jewish faith. I mean, that is a level of coordination and sophistication that even if it was all a big lie, I would still want to follow these people because they obviously know how to get things done on a scale and at a level of sophistication that is unheard of in the scope of human society. And even if you wanted to claim that Jesus' own followers hatched their own particular conspiracy to make him out to be the Son of God, which would be a lot more feasible considering they weren't separated by space and time the way the other biblical authors were, you still have to ask yourself, did they have something to gain, like Muhammad did, like Brigham Young did, or like the KGB did? And even if you want to conclude that they did in fact have something to gain, was it likely that they would succeed in this conspiracy? Their own account of the life of Jesus and the intense interest that he attracted from crowds of converts tells us that the reason people were so captivated by him was because of his teaching authority and his ability to perform miracles in front of crowds of eyewitnesses. Was it really reasonable for them to conclude that they could continue attracting followers in the same way? Because the people that were following Jesus weren't there to follow his followers. What would make them think that they could carry on growing the movement, attracting disciples now that Jesus was gone? Furthermore, and probably most important of all, if Jesus, with all of his influence and ability to inspire the multitudes, could be brutally arrested and executed by the Sanhedrin and the Romans, what would make his disciples think that they wouldn't meet the exact same fate if they tried to continue perpetuating his message? In fact, by their own accounts and the letters that we have from people like Peter, Paul, John, and James, it's abundantly obviously that they fully expected to meet that same fate. And they were right. All of them except for John, among the 12 apostles, were murdered. So what exactly would they have to gain by perpetuating the very same message that got Jesus himself killed? And how on earth could that be a rational recipe for attracting followers and converts? Who would want to attach themselves to a movement that would definitely gained them political persecution and then eventually execution. Yet they did persist in the claims that Jesus was who he said he was and did the things that we now are all familiar with. And somehow they did successfully attract huge crowds of converts, so that by the time that Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire, after hundreds of years and generations of brutal oppression, there were millions of them. Any conspiracy theory that you might propose that attempts to explain how the Bible was written and then how Jesus, this unknown working class person, managed to fulfill all of the core prophetic expectations of the Bible and of the Jewish people, and then how his followers decided to perpetuate all the claims about him in spite of no hope of success and the likelihood that they would get murdered for it, has to be way more outlandish than the kinds of things that eccentric people entertain about JFK, chemtrails, moon landings, or 9/11. And if you find those kinds of conspiracy theories unlikely or silly even, then you should find the ones that try to explain the advent of Christianity even more so. And what's even more strange about this is that most people do believe in something like God and the afterlife. How much further a stretch is it to then believe that the God who created you and created your soul wanted to be as accessible as possible to you so that he became human so that you could relate to him face to face and hear his teachings as they would have been delivered and recorded? That seems to me to be a lot more likely than the very irrational attempts to rationalize the story of Jesus that we are now all familiar with. Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we internet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.